The final boarding call for Flight 782 to Maui echoed through the terminal, a tinny promise of escape. Imani adjusted the strap of her carry-on, the worn fabric a familiar weight on her shoulder. 24 hours ago, she had been finishing a brutal double shift in the ER, the scent of antiseptic clinging to her hair. Now, all that stood between her and a week of sun-drenched peace was a jet bridge. The fatigue was a heavy blanket, but underneath it, a spark of anticipation flickered. No alarms, no codes, no life-or-death decisions resting on her tired shoulders. Just sand, sleep, and the sound of the ocean. A sudden, sharp thud cut through the airport's dull roar. It was a sound of substance, of dead weight meeting linoleum. Heads turned. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Imani's gaze followed the others, landing on a small, still circle in the river of travelers. A man was on the floor. People shuffled, craning their necks, their phones already emerging from pockets. No one moved toward him. They treated him like a traffic accident, a morbid curiosity to be observed from a safe distance. Imani's feet were moving before her brain gave the command. The nurse in her, the part that had been on autopilot for 16 hours straight, took over. Vacation could wait. A human being was on the ground. She pushed through the ring of onlookers, her light blue scrubs a stark contrast to the vacation wear and business suits surrounding her. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm and even, the practiced tone she used to clear a frantic emergency room. "I'm a nurse. Let me through." The crowd parted. The man lay on his side, his body curled slightly. He was dressed in a suit that cost more than her car, a charcoal gray so dark it was almost black. The tailoring was exquisite, bespoke, clinging to a frame that was lean but powerful. He was Asian, his black hair cut with razor precision. One hand was clenched into a fist on the floor, the knuckles white. The other was splayed near his face, revealing a heavy, platinum watch on his wrist. "Sir, can you hear me?" Imani knelt beside him, her professionalism a shield against the unnerving stillness of the scene. She pressed 2 fingers to his neck, searching for a pulse. It was there, but thready and erratic. His skin was clammy, coated in a sheen of cold sweat. His eyes flickered open. They were the darkest brown she had ever seen, so dark they absorbed the harsh airport light. They were not panicked or confused. They were analytical, furious. They swept over her face, her scrubs, her hands on his neck, cataloging every detail with a chilling intensity. "Don't touch me," he rasped, the words a low growl. Imani ignored him, her fingers moving to his wrist to check his radial pulse. "My name is Imani. I'm a registered nurse. I need you to stay still." 2 other men in similar, though less expensive, dark suits materialized, pushing through the crowd. They moved with a synchronized, predatory grace that set every nerve in Imani's body on high alert. These were not corporate assistants. "Get away from him," the taller one ordered, his hand reaching inside his jacket. Imani didn't flinch. She kept her eyes on the man on the floor. "He's tachycardic and diaphoretic. His pulse is weak. If you want him to live, you'll back off and call 911". The man on the floor, the boss, made a faint, almost imperceptible gesture with his fingers. The 2 men froze, their posture rigid with obedience. The authority in that small movement was absolute. It was more powerful than a shout, more effective than a drawn weapon. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with a danger that had nothing to do with a medical emergency. "What is your name?" the man on the floor asked, his voice strained. "I told you. It's Imani." She was already running through a mental checklist. Heart attack. Stroke. Seizure? The symptoms weren't quite right. His pupils were responsive, and there was no sign of facial drooping. "Imani," he repeated, tasting the syllables. He said her name differently than anyone else had. It wasn't a question or a statement. It was a claim, a label he was affixing to her in his mind. He pushed himself up onto one elbow, a tremor running through his arm. The effort cost him, a fresh wave of sweat beading on his forehead. "No paramedics. Get me out of here." That's not an option, she stated flatly. You could be having a myocardial infarction. You need to get to a hospital. A ghost of a smile, cold and humorless, touched his lips. It is not my heart. Before she could argue, a wave of violent tremors racked his body. His jaw clenched, and a low groan escaped his lips. Imani reacted instantly, rolling him onto his side, protecting his head from the hard floor. This was no ordinary collapse. It looked like a neurological event or perhaps poisoning. The thought surfaced, unbidden and terrifying, and suddenly the expensive suits and the silent commands made a dark, terrible kind of sense. The sounds of the airport faded into a dull hum. Her flight, her vacation, her entire normal life felt a million miles away. There was only the cold linoleum beneath her knees, the shuddering body of a dangerous stranger under her hands, and the weight of 2 pairs of hostile eyes boring into her back. The paramedics finally arrived, their presence breaking the spell. They took over with professional efficiency, but Imani noticed how the 2 dark-suited men shadowed their every move, their bodies tense, their hands never far from their jackets. As they loaded the man onto a gurney, his dark eyes found hers again. The fury was still there, but it was now mixed with something else. Something she couldn't name. One of his men stepped in front of her, blocking her view. He was built like a brick wall and looked just as friendly. "You missed your flight," he said. It wasn't an apology. "I see that." He produced a business card from his pocket. It was thick, black cardstock, completely blank except for a single phone number embossed in silver. He pressed it into her hand. "The boss will compensate you for your time. Be at the address we send to this number tomorrow at noon. Do not be late." The order was delivered in a low, non-negotiable tone. It was a summons. She watched them disappear into the crowd, flanking the gurney like royal guards, carving a path through the sea of people. The card felt cold and heavy in her palm. Her vacation was gone. And Imani had the sinking feeling that she had just traded a week in paradise for a journey into hell, all because she had stopped to help a man who collapsed at her feet. That was the moment everything changed. The address texted to her phone led to a sleek, glass and steel tower in the heart of Koreatown. The lobby was a sterile expanse of white marble and minimalist art, staffed by a receptionist whose smile never quite reached her eyes. Imani gave her name, and without a word, the woman gestured toward a private elevator. The ride was silent and swift, opening directly into a penthouse office that seemed to hang suspended over the city. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Los Angeles sprawl. The furniture was sparse and ruthlessly modern. And sitting behind a massive black desk, looking as if he were carved from the same cold material, was the man from the airport. Kwon Jin-woo. He looked better today. The deathly pallor was gone, replaced by a healthy complexion. He wore a crisp white shirt, the top 2 buttons undone, revealing the faint lines of ink coiling around his collarbone. The impossibly expensive suit was gone, but the air of absolute authority remained. He was not a man who recovered from weakness. He was a man who conquered it and discarded it. "Miss Imani," he said, his voice a low, smooth baritone, completely different from the strained rasp at the airport. He gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "Please." She sat, her back straight, her hands resting in her lap. She had deliberately worn her scrubs again, a silent reminder of the context of their meeting. This was a professional transaction, nothing more. "I trust you are well," she said, the words polite but cool. "I am," he confirmed. He slid a thick envelope across the polished surface of the desk. It landed with a soft, heavy thud. "For your trouble. For the flight you missed. For your silence." Imani looked at the envelope, then back at him. It was easily $10,000, maybe more. Enough to cover her vacation 10 times over. Enough to make a significant dent in her student loans. Enough to make her forget what she saw. "I don't want your money," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Jin-woo's eyebrow arched slightly. It was the only sign of his surprise. He leaned back in his chair, studying her. His gaze was intense, dissecting. He was trying to figure out her angle, what she wanted if not money. In his world, everyone wanted something. Everyone has a price, he stated, not as a cynical belief, but as a fundamental law of his universe. I did my job, she replied. It's what I'm trained to do. I'd have done it for anyone. You don't owe me anything. Nevertheless, he insisted, pushing the envelope a fraction of an inch closer to her. I have a debt to you. I do not like being in debt. That was when the first gunshot shattered the window behind him. The sound was like a physical blow. Glass exploded inward in a crystalline spray. Jin-woo moved before the first shard hit the floor. He was a blur of motion, vaulting over his desk, grabbing her, and pulling her down behind it in one fluid, economical movement. His body covered hers, a solid, unyielding shield. The air was filled with the acrid smell of cordite and the percussive roar of automatic gunfire chewing through the office. Imani's heart hammered against her ribs, but her mind was strangely clear. She could feel the hard planes of his chest pressed against her back, the warmth of him seeping through her scrubs. One of his arms was banded around her waist, holding her in place with bruising strength. His other hand held a sleek, black pistol that seemed to have appeared from nowhere. The scent of his cologne, something clean and sharp, like cedar and cold steel, filled her senses, a bizarrely intimate detail in the midst of chaos. The shooting stopped as abruptly as it began. In the ringing silence that followed, Jin-woo was perfectly still, listening. He was not breathing hard. He was not panicked. He was a predator, waiting, assessing. The silence stretched, thick with tension. Then he moved. He rose to a low crouch, his gun held steady in a two-handed grip. "Stay here," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. The command was absolute. He moved through the wrecked office like a phantom. He was all lethal grace and coiled power. She watched, mesmerized, as he cleared the room with a terrifying efficiency that spoke of years of practice. This was his language. Violence was his native tongue. His two men from the airport burst in from a side door, weapons drawn. A flurry of low, rapid Korean was exchanged. Jin-woo's face was a cold, implacable mask. One of the men, the taller one, approached him, bowing his head slightly. They came from the rooftop opposite. A sniper team. They are gone. Jin-woo's jaw tightened. He scanned the room, his eyes finally landing on Imani, still crouched behind the desk. He walked over, the gun now vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. He extended a hand to help her up. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking it. His grip was firm, his palm calloused. "You are not hurt?" he asked. She shook her head, unable to find her voice. Her gaze drifted to his side. A dark stain was spreading across his white shirt, just below his ribs. "You are," she said, her voice coming out as a croak. He glanced down, dismissing the wound with a wave of his hand. "It is nothing. A scratch." "Let me see." The nurse took over again, pushing aside the fear and adrenaline. She reached for the hem of his shirt, but he caught her wrist. His grip was gentle but inescapable. "It is not your concern." "The hell it isn't," she shot back, her fear transmuting into anger. "I'm the only one in this room who knows how to stop you from bleeding out on your expensive marble floor. Now let me see it." For a long moment, they stood locked in a battle of wills. His dark eyes searched hers, and whatever he found there made him relent. He gave a sharp nod, releasing her wrist. She lifted the fabric. It was a deep graze, furrowed and bleeding freely, a shard of glass or a stray bullet fragment having torn through the flesh. It wasn't life-threatening, but it needed to be cleaned and stitched. "We need to go," his man said urgently. "This location is compromised." Jin-woo nodded. "Take her with us."
"What?" "No," Imani protested.
"You can't just—" "I'm not going anywhere with you." Jin-woo turned to face her fully. The cold mask was back in place, but his eyes held a flicker of something she couldn't decipher. Regret? Resignation? "They saw you with me. They saw you arrive. They now know who you are. Until I handle this, you are a target. Leaving you is a death sentence. You will come with me." There was no room for argument. He wasn't asking. He was telling her a fact of her new, terrifying reality. She had a choice, of course. She could run. She could scream for help. But looking into the cold certainty of his eyes, she knew it was no choice at all. Running would only get her killed by people she couldn't see. Staying with him, that was a different kind of danger, but at least it was a danger she could look in the face. She gave a single, jerky nod.
Fine. She chose to stay.
And as they were bustled out of the building through a private service exit and into the back of a black, armored sedan, she caught her reflection in the tinted window. A tired nurse in pale blue scrubs, looking completely out of place in a world of bespoke suits and silent violence. The woman staring back at her was a stranger. The safe house was an unassuming suburban home in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood. Inside, it was a fortress. Reinforced doors, discreet security cameras, and a basement that looked more like an armory than a wine cellar. Jinwoo's men moved with quiet purpose, securing the perimeter, while Imani was led to a sterile, modern kitchen. Jinwoo sat at the large island, his shirt off, a towel pressed to his side. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with the aftermath of gunfire and the stark reality of her situation. She worked methodically, her hands steady as she cleaned his wound with supplies from a comprehensive first aid kit one of his men provided. He didn't flinch, didn't make a sound, just watched her with that unnerving, analytical gaze. "What was that at the airport?" she asked, her voice low as she threaded a surgical needle. He was silent for a long moment. "A message." "From who?"
"A rival."
"Someone who wants my territory." He shifted slightly as she began the first stitch, his muscles tensing under her fingers. The collapse was not a natural event. It was a poison, slow-acting, designed to mimic a cardiac event. Imani's hands froze.
Poison.
The thought she'd had at the airport came rushing back. Who would do that? A shadow passed over his face, a flicker of something deep and painful. It requires access.
Proximity.
Trust. He looked away, his gaze fixed on some point beyond the kitchen wall. It was my cousin. The betrayal hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. It was his wound, the one vulnerability he carried. Not the bleeding gash in his side, but the deeper cut of being betrayed by his own blood. It explained the cold fury in his eyes at the airport. It was the anger of a king who discovers a traitor in his own court. He failed, Jinwoo continued, his voice devoid of emotion. So now he allies himself with my enemies to finish the job. That is who attacked my office. That is who is hunting us now. She finished the last stitch, her movements precise and automatic. Her mind was reeling. She was caught in the middle of a Mafia war, a pawn in a game she didn't understand. She should be terrified. A part of her was. But another part, the part that had run toward a collapsed man instead of away, was focused on the problem at hand. She taped a clean dressing over the wound. Her fingers brushed against his skin, warm and solid. The contact sent a jolt through her, a current of awareness that was entirely separate from the clinical nature of her task. He went still, his breath hitching almost imperceptibly. Their eyes met. In that moment, the world narrowed to the space between them. The house, the guards, the unseen enemies, it all faded away. There was only the charged silence, the scent of antiseptic mixed with his cedar and steel cologne, and the weight of his gaze. He saw her, not just as a nurse or a witness or a liability. He saw her, and she saw, just for a second, the man beneath the cold, lethal exterior. A man who had been betrayed, who was carrying the weight of an empire on his shoulders, and who was now bleeding in a suburban kitchen. He broke the contact first, looking down at her handiwork. "You have a surgeon's skill." "I'm a nurse," she said softly. "We're the ones who actually keep people alive." A faint smile touched his lips again. This one was different. It held a trace of genuine, grudging respect. "That you are." The moment passed. The world rushed back in. But something had shifted. A fragile, unspoken connection had been forged in the crucible of violence and vulnerability. She had made a deliberate choice to stay when she could have run. She had put her hands on him, mended his flesh, and in doing so, had touched the man beneath the monster. She told herself it was just her training, her duty. She was lying to herself. Days bled into a week. They moved twice more, from the suburban house to a high-rise apartment with bulletproof windows, then to a secluded warehouse on the industrial outskirts of the city. Each location was a sterile, temporary cage. For Imani, it was a blur of forced proximity and simmering tension. For Jinwoo, it was a calculated chess game played across the city's underworld. She watched him command his empire through encrypted phones and hushed meetings. He was a master tactician, his mind always 3 steps ahead. He moved through his world of violence and betrayal with a calm, surgical precision that was both terrifying and captivating. He rarely slept, fueled by cold brew coffee and an unyielding will. And through it all, he watched her. She would catch him looking when she was reading a book scavenged from a shelf, or staring out the window at a world that was no longer hers. His expression was always the same, guarded, intense, unreadable. He said her name differently now. The hard, claiming edge was still there, but it was softened with something else, a new resonance that made the hairs on her arms stand up. The danger escalated. It was no longer a distant threat but a constant, pressing reality. One evening, a car bomb detonated 2 blocks from their building, a bomb clearly meant for the black sedan Jinwoo used. They had been minutes from leaving. The close call left Imani shaken, the scent of smoke and fear clinging to the air. That night, she found him on the balcony, a silhouette against the city lights. "They're getting closer," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They were never far," he replied, not turning. "This will end with one of you dead, won't it?" "This ends only one way," his certainty was absolute. It was the coldest thing she had ever heard. The next day, he asked her for the impossible. He needed information on a specific chemical compound, the base of the poison his cousin had used. His own people had hit a wall, but he knew the components were rare, restricted, traceable through medical and pharmaceutical supply chains. He slid a laptop across the table to her. "You have access to hospital networks, medical databases, things my men cannot get." She stared at the screen. He was asking her to break the law, to violate her professional ethics, the very principles she had built her life around. It was a line she had never imagined crossing. "I can't," she said, her voice shaking slightly. I could lose my license. I could go to jail." "I will not let that happen," he said simply, as if his will alone could bend the laws of the country. "You don't understand. This is everything I am. It's my entire life." "He will not stop," Jinwoo said, his voice dropping, becoming intimate, persuasive. "He will find you. What I am asking is a crime. What he will do to you is an atrocity. Choose." She looked at his face, at the exhaustion etched around his eyes, the relentless pressure he was under. She thought of the explosion, the feeling of the building shaking, the knowledge that her death had been a matter of minutes and miles. He was right. Her old life was already gone, burned away in the fire of his war. What was one more rule broken in a world that no longer had any? With trembling fingers, she opened the laptop. She bypassed firewalls and entered her credentials into the hospital's secure network. Each keystroke felt like a betrayal of the woman she used to be. She was doing something morally gray, crossing a line she could never uncross, all for a man who was the human embodiment of danger. She found it. A list of recent purchasers of the primary component. Only 3 in the state. 1 was a legitimate research university. 2 were shell corporations, both linked to a single offshore account. She showed him. He looked at the screen, then at her. A new kind of respect dawned in his eyes. He had pushed her, and she had not broken. She had bent. For him. That night, the tension that had been simmering between them finally broke. They were in the main living area of the warehouse, the cavernous space filled with shadows. He was cleaning his pistol, the metallic clicks the only sound. She was pacing, unable to settle. "Stop," he said, his voice quiet but commanding. She froze, turning to face him. He put the gun down and rose, walking toward her until he stood just a foot away. The air crackled. "You look at me," he began, his voice a low rumble, "and you see a monster." "I see a man who does what he believes he has to," she corrected softly. There is no difference. He took another step, closing the distance. He was so close, she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He reached out, his fingers gently tucking a stray curl behind her ear. His touch was electric, a spark in the darkness. Before you, my world was black and white.
Duty. Power.
Survival. There was no room for anything else. He leaned closer, his forehead almost touching hers. His dark eyes held hers captive. You are disruptive, he whispered. You are the first person in years who doesn't look at me with fear or greed. You look at me and see a man with a wound that needs stitching. It was the confession. Not of love, but of something far more dangerous. An admission of the effect she had on him. He was the most powerful, controlled man she had ever met, and she, a nurse from the real world, had somehow breached his defenses. I told myself staying was survival, she confessed in turn, her voice thick with emotion. That I had no choice. I was lying to myself. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed. He pulled it out, his face hardening as he read the message. A cold, lethal fury settled over him, erasing the flicker of vulnerability she had just seen. What is it? She asked. He held up the phone. It was a picture of the front door of her apartment. Taped to it was a single, dead black rose. They knew where she lived. They had been there. The war was no longer just his. They had made it hers. The enemy had made a move that targeted her directly, and in doing so, had signed their own death warrants. Jinwoo's face was carved from granite. This ends, he said, the words like chips of ice. Tonight. The final confrontation was set for the port of Los Angeles, a sprawling labyrinth of shipping containers and shadowy cranes. Jinwoo's cousin and his new allies were finalizing their deal, a transfer of territory and power, believing Jinwoo was still wounded and in hiding. They were wrong. Jinwoo was hunting. Imani insisted on coming. He had refused, fiercely, until she laid out her reasoning with the cold logic she had learned from him. The poison, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. When I was in the database, I saw the notes on its antidote. It's not stable. It has to be administered within a precise window after it's mixed, or it becomes toxic. If your cousin brought it, if he plans to use it on you again, you'll need me there. I'm the only one who knows the protocol. Her medical knowledge was her weapon. It was the only way she could be an asset, not a liability. He finally relented, his jaw tight with a reluctance that was almost protective. They moved in with a small elite team. The port was a ghost town at this hour, the only sounds the creak of metal and the distant cry of gulls. Jinwoo moved through the shadows like he was born to them. Imani followed close behind, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, a medical kit clutched in her hand. They found them in a clearing between stacks of containers, illuminated by the harsh glare of a single floodlight. The cousin stood beside a man with the cruel, scarred face of a rival boss. Money and documents were being exchanged. Jinwoo did not announce his presence. He let the silence and the shadows do it for him. One by one, his men neutralized the guards on the perimeter with brutal, silent efficiency. Then he stepped into the light. The surprise on his cousin's face was immediate, followed by pure, undiluted fear. The rival boss just smiled, drawing his weapon. I knew you wouldn't die that easily, Quan. The world exploded into motion. Gunfire echoed off the steel walls of the containers. Jinwoo moved with the choreography of a seasoned killer, using cover, firing with deadly accuracy. He was a force of nature, a study in controlled violence. Imani took cover behind a large forklift, her body pressed against the cold metal. This was his world, in all its raw, lethal honesty. A stray bullet ricocheted, catching Jinwoo in the shoulder. He grunted, stumbling back. In that split second of vulnerability, his cousin saw an opening. He lunged, not with a gun, but with a syringe pulled from his pocket. The antidote or the poison. Jinwoo! Imani screamed. Her shout was the only diversion he needed. Jinwoo pivoted, disarming his cousin with a sickening crack of bone. But the distraction had cost him. The rival boss was lining up a clean shot, his aim steady, centered on Jinwoo's chest. There was no time to think. Imani acted. She grabbed the heaviest thing in the medical kit, a small, portable defibrillator, and hurled it with all her strength at a stack of loose oil drums nearby. It hit with a deafening clang, a chaotic, unexpected noise in the middle of the firefight. The rival boss flinched, his head whipping toward the sound for a barest fraction of a second. It was all the time Jinwoo needed. 2 precise shots, and the man crumpled to the ground. Silence fell, heavy and absolute. Only Jinwoo and his cousin were left standing in the circle of light. The traitor looked at Jinwoo, his face a mask of terror and disbelief. "You were my brother," Jinwoo said, his voice quiet, heavy with a sorrow that was deeper than anger. "You left me with nothing," the cousin spat, clutching his broken arm. "I gave you everything." Jinwoo raised his pistol. There was no hesitation.
No merci.
A single, clean shot. A cost was paid. The price of betrayal was blood. He stood over the body of his own family, the smoke from his gun barrel curling into the damp night air. The cold, implacable boss was back in place, the empire secured. He turned to Imani. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes were a turbulent storm. He walked to her, his steps heavy. He looked at her, not at the chaos around them. He saw the way she stood her ground, the way she hadn't flinched from the ugliness of his world. She had not been rescued passively. She had acted decisively and saved his life. "My world is not safe for you," he said, his voice raw. It was the truest thing he had ever told her. "I know," she replied, her own voice just as steady. He reached out, his hand cupping her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. The gesture was incredibly tender, a stark contrast to the violence he had just committed. It was his acknowledgement of what she was to him. No longer deniable, no longer hidden. "But without you," he finished, his voice dropping to a whisper that was for her alone, "it is empty." The words hung in the air between them, more powerful than any declaration of love. It was a statement of fact, a truth carved from the heart of his dark empire. The choice was hers, and it had to be made now, in the shadow of death, with the scent of gunpowder still thick in the air. She looked from the body on the ground to the man standing before her. He was a killer, a king of a violent, merciless world. Nothing about him was safe or easy. He was a storm, and loving him would mean learning to live in the eye of it. Her old life was a ghost, a memory of a woman who followed rules and believed in simple things. That woman was gone. Imani raised her hand, placing it over his on her cheek. She did not run. She did not look away. Instead, with the entire port of Los Angeles as their witness, she took a single, deliberate step forward, closing the final inch of space between them. The choice was made.